leave that to you, yeah. The content on the slide is relatively little. There's only about 6 lines. All right. One of the members of council mentioned during the break an important observation in response to one of the questions earlier in the conversation. So I'm going to invite them to speak first before I launch on my presentation on the trust clause, just to kind of cover that base.
I just want to make a follow-up comment to my previous response in terms of what the financial task force had done in terms of the $1 million, and saying that the financial task force felt that that's what we would need in order to make the transition in a healthy way. And as I think about my role on a JDT as well as a facilitator on a JDT, one of the things that we are continually lifting up is that when we think about the dismissal of churches, what's most important is there's kind of 3 prongs to that. It's the health of thinking about the health of the PCUSA, the health of the presbytery, and the health of the local church. And so when I think about that, then when I think about the $1 million, then that's part of the equation as our JDT teams are all meeting and saying, okay, well, we've heard from the presbytery that for the transitional time, that it sounds like they're going to need $1 million in the transition at minimum. And so just to keep that aware as we work together for joint solutions of dismissal, is that we're looking at the health not only of the local church, but of the presbytery and also of the PCUSA. Those were the 3 things we were asked in our charge.
So the other half. So the other half of that from our council conversation during the break is if in fact then the JDTs were to designate, say, all of their dismissal package to the ministry of Tamara John or to our other new church developments, then that would mean that $1 million that Cheryl is talking about would not be available for helping the ongoing ministry. And if it's all designated, that will cause some problems for us. Partial designation would be great from our perspective.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and invite the team behind me to use my name if at any time they need to interrupt in order to either make a comment or ask a clarifying question, since I'm no longer in a position to see them. This portion is to communicate very briefly some of the needs around this thing called the trust clause in the Book of Order, because it does govern how we go forward, and some of it casts a shadow is probably the best metaphor that I can think of. It creates an environment in which the work that we do has to take place. And so what I want to do is introduce this part of the presentation with one of the questions that was given to me on a card. And I'm going to acknowledge that half of the question won't be answered yet, but this is a springboard. The question is, how can Los Ranchos Presbytery ask the churches seeking dismissal to pay to leave, thereby supporting theological beliefs with which we disagree? I'm going to acknowledge if there was already strain in making contributions that found their way to things like abortion and those kind of concerns that you might have had, I can imagine that there's some strain in thinking about money going to more activities of a denomination that you're trying to get separated from. The specific question, and that's the part that I'm not going to address yet, but the specific question is, how can Los Ranchos do this? And the answer is not how can we do this, but why must we do this? And that's really the substance of the next part of the morning. So I go ahead and invite the slide. Folks in the back, can you see the fine print well enough? Okay, we'll hit each of these one at a time. This is not the standard PowerPoint version where it goes zooming in from the left-hand side with each new comment that I make. My goal here is to talk through this all but for you to see it in such a way that if your mind wanders off of what I'm saying, you'll see something else that you'll have the opportunity to think about. I've broken this essentially into two categories of reflection on this matter. The first is the stuff that is obvious to an intelligent reader in the Book of Order. And then the second is the stuff that has become official interpretation of the church by way of the General Assembly Permanent Judicial Commission's ruling in the case of Tom, which is a case that has to do with the Presbytery of San Francisco and its dismissal of the Danville Presbyterian Church up in the East Bay. So the language, if you were to turn in your Book of Order to G-4.0203, there are three key facts that jump right out of that paragraph that we need to keep in mind in order to be functioning in a constitutional manner. The language used in that, here's the brief summary. All property, and then about 3 or 4 lines of, and it doesn't matter what it's about, is for the use and benefit of the Presbyterian Church USA. So let's hit line 3 here first. There's a whole lot of, it doesn't matter what it's about. In other words, whether it's the title is held by the congregation or whether the title is held by a presbytery or a synod or the office of the General Assembly. It also doesn't matter what it's used for. It doesn't matter if that property is a camp or a church building or an endowment fund that is there strictly to generate income, whether it's a programmatic kind of property or whether it's an investment kind of property. It doesn't matter. And that's then where the first line in it, but the second point in it, I'm working 3, 2, 1. The second point comes into play where it says all property. One of the common misunderstandings of this is that the word property means real property. The word property here actually means any kind of assets that are either financial assets or can reasonably be turned into financial assets. And this is where I have just probably reached the edge of my financial skill set. What I mean is we sometimes talk about people as an asset. That's not what this means. Because as of about 1865, we could no longer trade people for money and money for people. At least not in the United States, legally. But something like real property can reasonably, with some negotiation, be turned into something far more liquid. Something like an endowment can be evaluated for its value. Those kind of things figure in there. So that's what it means when it says all assets count, not just real property. If there's an endowment, if there's an income generating fund, those kind of things matter as well. It'll come back. Yeah, it'll come back. The use and benefit is the language that shows up in the paragraph. And what's interesting here actually is that it's come to be known as the trust clause. But trust clause doesn't really show up there. The title of this paragraph is All Property Held in Trust. And then down at the end, where it gets to use and benefit, it says, all property, therefore, blah, 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 is nevertheless held in trust for the use and benefit of the PCUSA. So the way that I would suggest you think about it is treat this as the use and benefit clause, because that clears away a lot of misunderstanding of what we're talking about. That whatever it is that is held by whatever kind of body that's in the PCUSA, those assets are for the use and benefit of the PCUSA. That is a stiff standard for us to meet, and it became far more stiff in its clarification of that standard in the Tom decision of about 1.5 years ago. There are three big implications that came out of the Tom decision, just really quick. Presbytery agreed to dismiss Danville Presbyterian Church for about 5 years of per capita giving and 5 years of mission giving, property free and clear in the name of the kingdom of God and for the glory of God, full stop. That one went all the way up as far as it could go on appeal, and the ruling of the PJC had about 7 fine points to it. One of those fine points is that the glory of God and the kingdom of God are good things, but they don't get tradable for real money. You can't say, okay, if we're doing it for the glory of God, it's cheaper than if we're not doing it for the glory of God. But among these things, the key implications in Tom were that each case is handled individually, that the presbytery is the one that's obligated to represent the interests of the PCUSA in its held in trust for the use and benefit kind of thing, and that whatever the final agreement is between the presbytery and the congregation, there's got to be correspondence. It's got to reflect those realities for it to be a sustainable agreement. One by one then. Each case handled individually has an interesting and important implication for the work that we're doing, given that we have 10 churches and 1 new church development that are all in the mix here. That is, you heard earlier that there is some benefit to kind of comparing notes and seeing, well, okay, are we all roughly in the same ballpark? How you go about deciding what the ballpark looks like is not for me to tell you. But what is for me to emphasize here is that it will not be a sustainable argument if there were to be any kind of appeal or complaint to say, we got this much because that church got that much. And it will not be a sustainable argument to say we should have had it turn out this way because it turned out this way with this other church. That's really the implication of the case-by-case basis. That if a complaint is brought against the presbytery, and it would be brought particular to every or any action of the presbytery, so that means it would have to do with a congregation one at a time. A complaint might be brought about the presbytery's decision about a congregation. But the Synod PJC, if it chooses to look at that case, will not be interested in what happens in the other 10 instances. That's what case by case means. Now, that's a separate question from whether the presbytery as a whole thinks that what it sees is reasonable. That may be a place where sort of things looking like they're in the same ballpark makes sense. It'll make sense potentially on a political level, but it would not make sense on a judicial level. The second item is Presbytery must represent the PCUSA interests. That is an explicit line in the Tom decision. Part of what was going on in San Francisco is, at least the version that I've been represented, is that San Francisco was satisfied. They voted yes to what happened in Danville. They thought, okay, this is fair, right? They're looking out for the mission and the administrative work of the presbytery into the years ahead. We want them to go with property and go in grace. So San Francisco was one of the first presbyteries to have what became known as the gracious dismissal policy, where it was essentially go with property, go with grace, we're good. And the Tom decision came down hard and said no. In fact, San Francisco violated its obligation as the trustee, as the fiduciary for the needs of the denomination. It's kind of like if you imagine a young person whose parents die before they reach majority age. That person is the beneficiary of the property of their parents. Somebody else serves as trustee to that property until that person reaches majority age, and it is the obligation of that trustee to use that money for the interests of the heir, the beneficiary, not for the interests of the trustee, or not even according to the trustee's own judgment. The trustee has to say, is this for the good of the beneficiary? So that question then comes back to, how can PLR do this? You know, how can we ask or insist on money, especially given that, you know, the money's going to be for a denomination that we have had our fill of? And the answer is because we are obligated to. If we don't, we are subject to review. And if that review goes badly, what it means is that there will be a longer and more painful process of waiting out the judicial process as it runs its course, and it will be out of the control of the presbytery rather than in the control of the presbytery. And if you follow the ways that things have gone in San Francisco in the last few years, I would suggest that that is a model we want to not get into. So then we find our way to the final item, which is that the final settlement must reflect above realities. There are a lot of technical terms in the Tom decision, things like consideration. Those sorts of things do never set down a percentage or a dollar amount, but what they do in every instance is they say, okay, does it quack like a duck? Does this resolution look like, genuinely speaking, people have taken into account the value of all of the property of the churches? Or does it look like they've just kind of filled out the list and then ignored it? That's going to matter. And here's how. More and more what I found myself thinking about with this process is that there are several gates that the churches are going to have to pass through on their way out. And the key is, how do we make sure that we get through each of those gates clean and straight? Gate one is the JDTs themselves, right? If you can't agree on your own inside, it's not looking good. Gate two then is the floor of presbytery. If the JDTs are unified and together with each other, standing and saying, we really think this is best for the church and for the presbytery, and it honors the Presbyterian Church USA's benefits in this matter, and we're sold on it, then the second one is passage within presbytery. You got to have a basic majority vote there. The third gate becomes more complicated, which is, even though a majority vote may be sustained in presbytery, you want to keep in the back of your mind, as you're settling out these questions on the JDT, keep in the back of your mind the person or persons who most will object, and why perhaps they will object. And will they object so strongly that they feel compelled to bring a complaint to the synod against what the presbytery has done? In other words, you're not going to win the day just by winning a majority vote. You may need to win the day by winning the foot draggers in the room as well. And I'm not going to suggest to you who those individuals are by name. Some of you who've been around the presbytery may be able to imagine in your minds who you think those individuals might be. Keep that as a test of, will this get us through? The fourth gate is the congregation. Because even when the presbytery has said, looks good to us, and even when the foot draggers maybe have said, you know, I'm okay with this, I'm not thrilled, but I can see why we'd want to accept it. Still got to get the session and the congregation of the church on board. So it's also not a matter of the JDTs overwhelming the church with their power of saying, we can do whatever we want to, because the church might end up saying, well, we don't want to do it then, we're just going to vote no. That's another gate you got to get through. And then the final gate is, if there is a complaint, what's it going to do within the Synod Permanent Judicial Commission? What's going to happen there in judicial process? So as you're working this out, keep those bodies in mind, because those are who you're really speaking for when you're sitting around the table. And those are the folks who are going to ultimately have sort of the up or down test on whether this keeps on moving forward. Okay, that's about all I've got on the trust clause specifically. there's a question here that, if I'm understanding it right, is kind of answered and kind of needs to be answered specifically. It's, are there required components in any joint settlement or solution? Example, would a figure that relates directly to all the value of the property be sufficient or meet the test? I think the answer is, if there's sort of a sum total, if you go with Appendix B and you fill the lines in, and there's a sum total at the bottom, and then there's some narrative that explains the match, how did the JDT come to the final amount relative to the sum total, then you're looking at an answer that would probably not only satisfy people like me and people like the floor of Presbytery, would also satisfy the PJC and Synod, such that, actually they're the ones you need to worry about more than the person who's feeling litigious. Somebody complains, goes to Synod, the question is, will it be sustained? Will the complaint be sustained? That's more important. And the answer there is, if it all adds up and there's if it's quacking like a duck, Synod PJC will probably be satisfied. One of the places, though, that I think there may be kind of an important comment in this sort of, are there required components, is the question was put to me not long ago. What about the difference between assessed value, appraised value, and insured value? Just give me kind of a wag of the head if you've had to deal with that question in your group. Anybody not? Lucky you. So I put that question to Neil Wells, who was the lawyer guy who did the initial training on that portion of it. And his response was that assessed value probably would not be sustained in California under the Synod PJC process, because assessed value is original value at purchase plus improvements plus 2% a year. As a layperson, I'm thinking that may have something to do with Proposition 13. Yes. Okay. What Neil said is that you don't have to get all anxious about getting the number exactly right, but something like insured value, something like appraised value, something like comps from the realtors is the zone as far as real estate property value that needs to be considered for it to be sustainable if it goes on forward. I'm going to assume that that one is covered. I'm not seeing otherwise. Okay. Another question which is good and worth response is, there's been a focus on the trust for the benefit of the denomination. What responsibilities does the denomination have in its fiduciary responsibility to the congregations? Had I known that question ahead of time, I would have kind of done my homework and figured out how to nail it out. But I think that what I would probably offer there could be disappointing if you're looking for fiduciary obligations. But the answer that I would offer is, because we are this kind of church, what does it mean? A church that is one church with 10,000 different locations in congregations rather than an affiliation of 10,000 churches. Because we're this kind of church, what does it mean for us to look out for one another? And I may put that question to Steve in a minute too, since he's had substantially more experience at the General Assembly level than I have. But what I want to do is begin with a story that I was told, or a story that I'll tell you from a couple years back. I was at a polity conference in Louisville, which is what stated clerks love to do, and met with the guy who's essentially number 2 there. He's the operations manager in Louisville. And he made the comment, he said, the way that we are structured now, and this was a few years back, is forcing churches to act like 1950s style organizations in a day when those don't make sense anymore. We are structured in a way that General Motors is the norm, and it's killing our congregations. And my job as ops manager in General Assembly is to tear down enough of those requirements so that the churches can function in a nimbler, more forward-looking manner. But I am too old, he said, to build what's new. It is my generation's job to take down what is choking the life of the congregation, so that your generation can build up something that will serve the life of the congregation. So I think there's some things that are going to continue. Board of Pensions is going to continue. Technical staff support for churches seeking new pastors is going to continue. Support for how pastors are groomed up into ministry is going to continue. A lot of those kind of things that a big church around the country can do much better than each individual one working itself out can do. Those are the ways in which the PCUSA will continue to live out its obligations to the idea that ministry really ultimately belongs on the front lines. But I'd put that one to Steve to see if there's more to say there. Does a higher level of dismissing churches' past contributions mean that the congregation's dismissal money should be higher because of the loss to LRP's future capacity, or lower because the church has not, what's that word? Oh, because the church has not taken huge resources from LRP. So in other words, is there the generosity penalty? Maybe. What I'm going to do instead, and then I chose deliberately to put this question in the context of the trust clause because I think there's an important correlation here, or at least I sure hope there is, which is that the churches who have given more to Los Ranchos Presbytery historically, I am hoping, are the churches with substantially more resources. And therefore it will mean that they, because of the fact that they have substantial more resources, not because of the fact that they've given more, will probably need to give more now in order for those resources to reflect adherence to the trust clause, as opposed to a small church which doesn't have very many resources and has maybe given the widow's mite, but less will be expected. Now, that may sound like a dodge. Certainly, it doesn't get into the question of the generosity penalty. But I think that the answer is, think about it as a correlation or relationship between the two. And think more, if you can, especially if you're on the church's side of it, of what can we give, given who we are, to the presbytery as an act of goodwill, given the resources that we have, given the members that we have. And then on the presbytery side, the answer will be, how much latitude can we extend while still remaining true to our obligations to the trust clause, to this congregation for the sake of its ministry going forward. Because that's, though, kind of a money question, I'd also probably turn it back, sort of, should there or shouldn't there be a generosity penalty? Would any of you like to field that?
Rather than having a penalty, I would suggest a different benchmark. What is the average across Los Ranchos per member contributed? Take the total that comes in per capita, the total that comes in by mission, divide that by our 18,000 members, and then apply that to whatever the church is, and it sort of neutralizes whether there's a penalty or not.
I will offer another thought. The idea is there a penalty for generosity, but in the same set, is there a windfall if you've not been generous? So I think that obviously per capita is per capita. Historically, only about 70% of our churches, I think, contribute general mission. Fewer than that. Well, back when I did the numbers, it was 70%, so it's fewer than that. So when I think of the issue of what is as we talk about reasonable settlement, off what the Tom decision said you couldn't do, just base it off of mission per capita. So it's really, it's looking at what is the health of the presbytery and how do we help the presbytery move forward, as well as what is the health of the local congregation and how do we help that move forward. And we're looking at things like mission and per capita, but then we're also looking at the property and all of the assets. So I don't know that, I agree totally with Forrest that the congregations that have given more typically have a larger congregation, larger properties, larger assets, and so their percentage has been given. But I will tell you that up until 2 years ago, Little Garden Grove First Presbyterian Church was the largest mission giver per member by over $60 per member, I think, as I recall. Unfortunately, we've had some significant deaths in our congregation and had to reduce our general mission giving. So size doesn't always determine generosity.
I would also say that as an organic church, that is, that we're a connectional church, that even our foreparents thought of us as an organic whole together, this language and the frame of giving to the presbytery or giving to the PCUSA as giving to them as a part or separate from giving to our common mission, that's a relatively new way of thinking about the church. And so as we use this language, we also need to ask ourselves, what is our view of what it means to be in community? What does the book of Acts tell us about sharing all things in common, and what it says about our giving? And so just an organic view of the nature of the church is something that might need to come into the conversation.
The next question we have on the trust clause, actually I am going to sit. How is the use and benefit of the PCUSA met if all of the settlement funds were retained by Los Ranchos? That's a polity matter. The way that the Book of Order, the form of government, structures the ministry of the PCUSA is that it is done by the presbyteries through the churches. So that which is a presbytery asset is for the use and benefit of the PCUSA. It's important there, especially if you're part of the group of folks who are uncomfortable with the way that the General Assembly, the national structured offices use money, or the way the Board of Pensions uses some money. If those are places of disagreement, it's important to understand that the use and benefit of the Presbyterian Church USA does not mean it has to go to the office of the General Assembly. It has to be done in the larger work of the denomination, which is handled by presbyteries individually as they see fit.
Forrest, I have a question that was inspired by an earlier question regarding conflict of interests. And please tell me if this is out of order. Some members of Presbytery have asked if there's a conflict of interest of having members on JDTs who are also members of churches requesting dismissal. And they're asking the question, is that going to open the door to some sort of complaint or challenge because of that membership on a JDT and also in a congregation that is seeking dismissal?
Okay, there are three questions and answers there. One is it possible that somebody would use that as a basis for complaint? The answer is yes. You know, the thing is that there's always the possibility that somebody's going to use something as the basis for a complaint. The second question then that becomes more important is, would that kind of complaint be sustained by the synod? The answer that I give is a qualified probably not. And the reason that I would give it is that the presbytery was the one that voted for these people to be on the JDTs. These are people who are members of presbytery who were elected by presbytery to serve in that capacity. The will of the presbytery, as Robert's rules and Book of Order and everything, the will of the presbytery was done when those people were elected, and it belongs properly to the presbytery to express its will that way. If I were on the Synod PJC, that's the argument that I would begin with until I heard a better one. I do think that it is right to suppose that if there's a conflict of interest in one instance, that there could be a conflict of interest in the other. And I do think that the eyebrow test may be a tough one for us, which will be why it's all the more important for both, for everybody giving a presentation to say, we're on board with this. We really do think this is right for the presbytery and the church. And the reason that I say everybody is that I believe, if I'm remembering right, that all of your teams have somebody who is part of a staying church. Not part of a church that might be leaving, not a part of a church that's committed to leaving, but there is a staying person in every group. And that person may be one of the ones that you want to check your stuff out with pretty carefully, because of their different perspective on things than other folks. They might help you with that. What about the one who doesn't like what they're seeing, even though it's agreed by a majority of presbytery? Does that kind of answer?
Thank you. Now I know how to answer. Appreciate it.
Forrest?
Yeah.
May I respond to the previous question about how does giving to the Presbytery of Los Ranchos that's kept here benefit the whole PCUSA? And I would just like to share a comment about how I think of this and how I think we have been thinking about this in terms of our contribution to the denomination as the Presbytery of Los Ranchos. My firm belief that the best way to contribute to the welfare of the PCUSA is to be a healthy presbytery. I think that's more important even than contributing funds. I would even say that. So our investment in the PCUSA is not only through general mission giving, which we are relatively generous about compared to many of the presbyteries, but the investments that we make in the things that we are committed to developing excellence in are things that will affect the PCUSA. I think it's arguable one of the best things the PCUSA is doing right now is in the area of evangelism and church growth with the 1,001 New Worshiping Communities movement. And it's very fair to say that Los Ranchos has had a very significant impact on that through personnel, through leadership that we provided, through the shaping of the ideas, through the training of the top leaders, even providing leaders for that movement. So it is not inconsistent with being committed to the welfare of the whole PCUSA to be deeply invested in developing the excellence that we're committed to doing here. I think that our health benefits then the whole denomination.
A couple of questions that were triggered by the matter of, kind of the specter of judicial appeal. One of those is, will those who most object be invited to voice their objection, and will that objection be forwarded to the JDT between the first and the second reading of the proposal? Yes. The rule in General Assembly is that for somebody to stand up on the floor of General Assembly and say something like a minority report, they have to first mention it in the committee. We don't have that rule here. So People will be invited to do that, but even if they don't, it doesn't negate their standing to do it later. It just hopefully will address some of the things in a more orderly manner. The next question is, could you see a bonus amount of a certain amount of money as a gift being part of the settlement if there is no judicial appeal filed to slow the process? Now, I really like the creativity here.
What happens in Las Vegas?
I'm working this one in my mind, right? And I'm thinking, okay, it cannot be that this money will be given and the condition is that there will be no, we promise to give this money, Los Ranchos promises not to file an appeal. We can't do that because every person in the presbytery who is a member always has standing to file a complaint. We can't take it away from them, even if you offered us $300 million. If this is your question, talk to Lanny afterwards. I'm even kind of thinking about, okay, what would it look like? How could it be written up? I think there might be a way to write it up. I think if it did go to appeal, then that thing would get shot down faster than, one of the Red Baron's opponents in World War I. Okay. Switching subjects now. I think we've hit the trust clause at least as much as the cards on the table suggest to me. I do promise to get back to that theological belief piece. Although, we've kind of tackled that in some, saying it's going to be in the presbytery. If you disagree with the theology of the presbytery, we've got another conversation that we can't have time for today. But if it's a denominational OGA kind of objection, I think I've got one more response to that before the day's over, but I kind of want to bring that toward the end with a couple other pieces. If we can have the next slide. I'm now moving toward nuts and bolts, and you've got a stack of cards like that, so I want to kind of click through some of those because a lot of this for you has to do with how do we get to the end? What's it actually going to look like? And so what I want to do first is throw a few options on the board and invite the panelists to include other things that may have occurred to them. These are things that have come out of your teams, people are talking about in one form or another, and it's like, what about this? These are not required by the policy, but rather they are things that the teams are encouraged to have a conversation about because some of these kind of moments might be a deal changer. It might be the kind of thing of, oh, well, if that's there, we're good. Compared to, I just don't know about this. So here's the quickies. A reversion clause. Hands if you've heard of that phrase. Okay, about 2/3 to 3/4, enough for me to mention it. The reversion clause is the idea that the presbytery is dismissing these churches to another reformed body. In most of your instances, I think I'm hearing ECO, maybe Evangelical Presbyterian Church, maybe Presbyterian Church of America, maybe Orthodox Presbyterian Church. But in each case, we've got a reformed body that fits the definitions that we voted on in February of what an appropriately recognized body to which we could dismiss a church looks like. The reversion clause says if you do a hop and a skip and you're on your way to something else, then the property all reverts back to the presbytery. And what that is in place for is to make sure that your churches remain reformed in a reformed government kind of denomination rather than suddenly becoming First Community Church of wherever. That protects the presbytery. It also protects the church in the sense that it creates a door back into a superstructure if the superstructure you had been counting on kind of falls apart. And the example I have here is, what if a church in the next 2 or 3 years collapses? And then do you have members squabbling with members over how to divide up the property? Rather, what this does is it puts in place a solution that says it comes back to the presbytery, and the presbytery then figures out how to work it out with regard to ministry. If you were at the presbytery meeting in February, you'll remember that we're doing that very thing with a significant amount of assets for Irvine Taiwanese. That is suddenly not a single new church development working its way forward, but it's sort of this split. And they specifically came to us and said, we can't figure out how to divide this up, we need your help. That's one of the things that presbyteries do well. It's a fallback position. You may seriously want to entertain it as you're working your way toward home. Percentages for congregational approval. This was kind of made fresh because of some of the stuff going on in Texas recently. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry yourselves. But there was a church that voted just shy of 2/3 to leave the denomination, and it wasn't enough according to the policies of the presbytery. The presbytery here does not set any standard bar. It just says essentially that the session shall take action and the congregation shall take action. Definition of Robert's Rules of take action is majority vote, 50% plus one more person. If your sense is that that would create a mess for the congregation that you're trying to serve here, because the other thing is a lot of congregations' quorum counts is 10%. So imagine 51% of 10% of the congregation votes to go, or votes to accept the thing that the presbytery is proposing. It could be a nightmare, and I do not want to be the pastor leading that church at that moment. So do you as a JDT want to suggest or require, as part of the terms of dismissal, that the pass rate in the congregation be a higher percentage than the normal quorum of the membership and a higher percentage than a simple majority? Again, not required of you. 51% of 10% is what the presbytery's standard is if you do nothing. You may want to decide whether you not do nothing. Yeah?
That is unless the local congregation has done other quorum numbers, correct?
Correct. Your bylaws will govern what your quorum is. Formal commitments for missional partnerships. We've already talked about that in some of these questions, right? As if you're planning on doing something where you want to be part of the ongoing support of a ministry that you like going on within the presbytery, and you want to make sure money goes to that as opposed to something else, that's something to write up in the joint resolution. Don't just expect it on a handshake. The flip side is, if you're representing the presbytery and the church promises to do this, don't just expect them to do this on a handshake. Make it part of the formal write-up. Because remember, there came a day when Pharaoh didn't know who Joseph was. That's, and if it had been written down in the annals of the pharaohs, maybe the Hebrew people would have had a different event in Exodus 1. How to handle existing new church developments, new worshiping fellowships, new worshiping communities, I don't care what you call them. Several of you, if I'm remembering right, are housing immigrant fellowships, non-church churches on your campuses. Those are part of the presbytery's responsibility. What's going to happen to them when you're not part of the presbytery? I urge you to spell that out. And long-term leases. This is a little different than the others. This is, again, an attempt to sort of think creatively. What if the presbytery kept the real property and leased it to the congregation? I think that's enough of that one. Unless I'm not being clear. Wag your head. Is that clear? I'm not seeing anybody object. Okay. So, There may be others. In fact, I'd invite the folks behind me right now, if you can think of others, to kind of pitch to the JDTs as you might want to consider this idea as an angle on things. Yeah.
The long-term lease idea was mine because I see a lot of small congregations in our presbytery, and I don't know if they're a part of any of the groups that are leaving, where any kind of financial settlement could put them in jeopardy. And that's where the long-term lease idea came in for the real property, the buildings and land, might give them an avenue to continue their ministry where they are without the worry of losing their property down the road because they don't have enough money to make their property tax payments. And for some of the small churches, I think that's a very real possibility. But, you know, it's not something the trustees are advocating, it's just an idea.
Different subject, but related to your financial terms. In a deal, there's price and there's structure. Look for the win-win. There may be ways that you can consider how to structure whatever the payment is in a way that is likely to be more positively received by the local congregation and also more positively received by Presbytery. I'll give you a specific. The local congregation has a distaste for paying twice for the real estate, as they would put it. If you have a structure that's got some portion allocated to clear title to the real estate, separated from paying a price for the property, and then there's another component of the structure that has continuing support over some period of time to support Los Ranchos Presbytery, the win-win there is a structure of that type is likely to be more palatable to a congregation which objects to paying twice for the property, and it also demonstrates good faith on both sides that the dismissing congregation is continuing its support for the presbytery.
Any other responses?
Maybe something to add regarding the reversion clause, Forrest. My encouragement would be to consider this seriously, partly because as there is a suspicion on the part of some, especially those who wish to leave, about the intentions of those remaining in the presbytery, there are also suspicions on the part of those who are not happy about some of you wanting to leave. And they wonder what motivates this. And there is a fear among some that this is a move to leave to an instrument that would allow the church that's dismissed then to, in a short period of time, simply leave again from whatever body they were dismissed to and be able to be an independent body. And it leaves some Presbyterians feeling uneasy about and feeling not responsible about dismissing to such a condition. So the reversion clause was inserted, well, it has been used in a number of cases, and I'll just share this one example of last Sunday. The Menlo Park Church voted to the settlement which the Presbytery had agreed to, and a church of 3,400 members voted with about 2,020-some members for, and 158 voted against the settlement. So they agreed wholeheartedly on it as a congregation. And it did include a 5-year reversion clause. It says that one of the conditions is that the settlement will be good as long as for 5 years Menlo Park remains either a member of ECO or some reformed body. If it doesn't, then the property would revert back to the Presbytery of San Francisco. We all expect them to do that, but it was there as a kind of a word of comfort also for the presbyters who remain in the presbytery.
Once, twice. Okay. I'm actually going to throw one more on the board that it occurs to me this card kind of fits that. And you may want to entertain this card as another bullet point on the screen right now. This person writes, let's focus on the positive results and possibilities that this current crisis or conflict has or will produce. List ways that leaving or in the positive realignment will actually benefit the PCUSA and Los Ranchos Presbytery and the leaving churches. The writer says, I see this as a win-win for all. Maybe the person who wrote this needs to get together with the person who wrote the less lose, less lose. And if you two can agree on something, share it with the rest of us. That's a little flippant. I don't see why a joint resolution report should not include a statement like that. If there is a way that you can get to a statement like that in your work to articulate that, that'll be an important part of what the Presbytery would benefit from hearing. All right, we are at about a quarter of an hour till the finish, and there are a bunch of questions regarding getting her done. Here's what I'm going to do. I am going to keep on talking and answering those questions with the folks behind me as long as it takes to get them finished. You are free to go when you have to go, because 12:30 is what we committed to and what you committed to, and especially if your blood sugar is telling you it's time to go, by all means. I might suggest that if you are in the middle of a pew row and fit that description, and you know you fit that description, that you start finding your way to the aisle. But I'm going to go ahead and launch. All of these are